Well, welcome to session 8 as we're looking at a series based on Genesis chapter 1 through to 11 and really just simply asking a question: what was the author's intention? We're not trying to ignore all the controversy and debate that surrounds the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We're just simply putting those aside for a moment so that perhaps we can take a different view and have a fresh look at what the authors were trying to say to us, what kind of questions they wanted to address. In our last session 7, we explored an overview of Genesis 6 through to 9. And out of that emerged the way that the author particularly applies a particular form of narrative writing in the way that he approaches his subject material. Alongside that, that technique enabled him then to focus in on what we perceive to be the key verse in this particular section, and we'll be looking at that next time, which was, of course, Genesis chapter 8 and verse 1. Alongside that, we've acknowledged that the author at that time was reworking some of the existing flood narratives that existed in Mesopotamia and later on in Persia and even through to Greek and Roman culture, of course. And the author is reworking it and beginning to give us some fresh theological insights from a very different place than the writers of those particular flood narratives that we find elsewhere. We noted that one of the surprising things about Genesis 6 through to Genesis 9 is that we can actually derive a particular form of chronology from it, which is unusual in these early chapters of Genesis. We can set something of a timetable of events. And of course, the chronology of the events helps us to think about some of the challenges that were faced through the story of the flood. For example, the author in Genesis 1 and 2 presents creation within the span of 6 days into a seventh day, the Sabbath, whereas, of course, what we see here in the flood story, if you like, the recreation story, although not a total recreation, takes a much longer period. So all of that highlights different things that the author wanted us to notice out of these particular narratives. Then we went on to look at that opening section of Genesis chapter 6, and we looked at the first 8 verses, and we acknowledged that we could so very easily get caught up in some of the mystique, the mysticism surrounding some of the things that we're told about in those particular verses, and how easily that can attract our attention, and we can miss out on the key to that passage, which of course is Genesis 6 verse 6, where we're told about the pain that God experiences through what he sees in the way that humanity, his created humanity, has gone so far away from what he first intended. So today we're going to look at Genesis 6 and verse 9 through to the end of Genesis 7. I'm going to read some of that. I will read, I think, all of it really, because I think it's an incredible story that is unfolding for us. So beginning at verse 9 of chapter 6. This is the account of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of the time, and he walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on the earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Make a roof for it and finish the ark to within 18 inches of the top. Put a door in the side of the ark and make a lower, middle, and upper deck. I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Noah did everything just as the Lord commanded him. The Lord then said to Noah, Go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found your righteousness in this generation. Take with you 7 of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 2 of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate. And also 7 of every kinds of birds, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe out from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. And Noah did all the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters came on the earth, and Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives entered into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds and all creatures that move along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark as God had commanded them. And after the 7 days, the floodwaters came on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, and on the 17th day of the 2nd month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. And rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. On that very day, Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together with his wife and the wives of his 3 sons, entered the ark. They had with them every kind of wild animal according to its kind, all livestock according to their kinds, every creature that moves along the ground according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, everything with wings. Pairs of all creatures that have breath of life in them came to Noah and entered the ark. The animals going in were male and female of every living thing, as God had commanded Noah. Then the Lord shut him in. For 40 days the flood kept coming on the earth, and as the waters increased, they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the waters. They rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 20 feet. Every living thing that moved on the earth perished, birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that has the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out, men and animals, and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds of the air were wiped out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. Well, let's think first of all about the very nature of a flood. Of course, of all human disasters, of all the disasters, the terrible disasters that we see right across this world, a flood has a particular chill-in place in the scheme of things. And I think the author has deliberately chosen this particular medium to tell their story, as it would have connected with people who had experienced floods in their own lives. Whether this is a localized flood or whether this was a global flood, well, the author really isn't asking us to focus on the extent of the flood. He particularly wants us to focus on a series of questions which he's hoping to address through this particular story, the story of the flood. I think those questions would include such things as, what kind of God would do such a thing as this? What has caused these actions to take place? Where is the despair in this story? And where can we find some hope in this story? And of course, how does this connect with what we already know in the previous chapters? And how will this connect in the chapters that we're going to address in the days to come? The focus of the author is very much on the very nature of God. What kind of God is it that brings about this particular flood? And of course, what the author wants us to understand is that the God he's referencing, is a very different kind of God, or gods, as we see in many of the other flood stories that were in existence at the time. This God fundamentally is different to the gods or the God that we see in other forms of the flood stories. This God, as we saw at the moment of creation, is a God who sees and knows and acts. Instead, as we saw in Genesis 1 and 2, where God sees his creation is good, when God sees in this context, in this particular section, he sees that everything has become quite the opposite. Everything has become bad. Everything has been corrupted. And although it pains him, it causes grief to him, that mixture of pain, but also that need to respond in some way, because inevitably actions carry consequences. We see that although it pains God to do so, this God will act in judgment. The author uses the kind of language that a judge would use when they're pronouncing a particular sentence. It's very important for the author that we picture God in terms of a judge. He's acting with impunity. He's acting in not an unreasonable way. He is just matching the crime. He's fitting the crime with this particular penalty, the penalty that has to be paid for what has gone wrong. And also the author wants us to understand that this God is not unreasonable or unfair, that this God has good grounds for the judgments that he's about to bring. One scholar described what God viewed as he looked at the earth as a violent breach of a just order. And I think that captures what has happened. God is a God of justice. He creates a just order in his world, but this is a violent breach of that, a violation of all that God has put into place. And of course, the outcome for that and because of that, is that there will be a penalty, there will be a judgment which is about to come. Throughout, the author uses the Yahweh name for God, which of course, if you remember in previous sessions, we saw is a very relational name for God. And so, again, the author is trying to connect us with a God who's not unsympathetic. This isn't a harsh God. This is a God who is intent on relationship with the whole of his creation, but that relationship has become so distorted that the outcome is inevitable, that God will act in judgment. It's Noah, of course, who is the recipient of God's grace. We read that Noah found favor in God's sight, which is a reminder that grace had come to Noah even before he begins to act in obedience, as we see he will later on in the chapter. And the author wants us to understand that grace, the grace of God, reaches out to us in the first place. And whatever response we make, particularly like Noah, in the way that he acted obediently, is a reflection of God's grace in the first place. So grace always comes before human response in that way. The author is intent, as we've already seen, to tell us the pain that is in God's heart as he contemplates the way that he has to destroy the works of his hands. How far we've come in such a short space of time. We're only in chapter 6, and already what has happened is that where we were in chapter 1 and 2 has completely gone off the rails in such a short space of time. And the author is trying to emphasize that that's how life is sometimes. What is seemingly good so quickly can turn to bad. And here we see it unfolding in the story that we find in Genesis chapter 6 through to Genesis chapter 9. God's order, his intent, is being ignored. And of course, disorder begins to reign in God's world. The world, in response to that, will return to some kind of primeval order, the sort of order that we find in those opening verses of Genesis chapter 1 and verses 1 to 2, where we picture this sense of an abyss. We picture this sense of a primeval order to things. The waters are everywhere. And what we're finding here is that picture that we find in Genesis chapter 1 is now being replicated, repeated for us. It's as though everything has gone back to the disorder out of which God in the first place created order. And it's a reminder again, the author is saying, here is God facing the reality, the pain that causes for him, that he has to renew his creation. And we're only at chapter 6. It's a tragic account of how quickly things can go wrong. The picture of a grieving God, grieving over the chaos that has returned. And of course, grief is a very intense form of sorrow. It's painful. And there's a cry from God, a cry of righteous anger, an anguish mingled with tears that the author wants us to grasp and understand. God is not dispassionate about his judgment. He's not clinical. And of course, whatever the outcome is, the judgment that's about to arrive. This is a just God, a just judge, a God filled with grace and intimacy, who has been brought to the point where, to restore any sense of hope, the most terrible things have to happen. And I think the author wants us to feel the pain of that, not just to see it as some story that has been told from generation to generation that maybe we've grown up with in the past. This is an immensely painful story, and of course a story that is rooted in the very fabric and nature of a world that is not as God intended it to be. The second thing that I think the author really wants us to focus in on is this provision of a means of salvation. Things are desperately bad, but God, in that context, provides a means for salvation. And the ark is the, if you like, the symbol, the feature of God's provision in this particular story. It's huge in its dimensions, of course, but it's limited in its means of salvation. This ark is not built for the whole of creation. Maybe we've grown up on those cartoons pictures where we've seen Noah standing there preaching and telling people to get into the ark. Well, they couldn't get into the ark because they couldn't fit into the ark. That was just simply not possible, not physically possible. If people had repented, they wouldn't have needed to get into the ark. In fact, there would be no need for the ark itself. This ark is built to save Noah and his family, and, of course, some of the creatures that God has created. It's not for everyone. It can't be for the whole of creation. It's not that kind of size. It is merely to accomplish a means of salvation for the few in this context, and not the many. It cannot be the means of salvation for the whole of creation. It's not, of course, that people refuse to get into the ark. As I say, the ark is designed for Noah and his family. And unlike the Mesopotamian sagas or flood stories, where the description of the kind of boats that provides the means of safety from the flood is very sort of cube-shaped, the ark that we find described here by our author is actually quite realistic. This could have floated. And so, although the author may be telling a particular story, maybe it's a parable, maybe it's a literal story, whatever the author is intending at this particular point, we see that the author is determined to bring a measure of realism into the story. He wants us to see this as a real story, whatever else we understand about it. The ark could float. The design is capable of that, which, of course, as I say, adds that realism to the story. Let's think about the ark itself for just a moment. What a terrifying place the ark must have been. It had no natural light. It had windows, but those windows were closed for 40 days, sealed up by God. So there's no artificial light in the ark. It is really a picture of a tomb. And of course, it's going to be horribly smelly and uncomfortable inside. And I think what the author is trying to tell us here, however we understand this story, is that this is a place of total trust. That's why, prior to entering the ark, Noah is given this covenant, this commitment from God. We find that in Genesis 6 verses 17 to 18. God promises that through the ark they will be saved. So as awful as the conditions must have been inside the ark, this tomb-like space, this sepulchre in that way, however difficult they were, and they were difficult, there is hope. They can trust in the promise of God that God would not abandon them, that God would remember them and would bring them through this difficult time. It's worth noting at this point, of course, that here we have a covenant that predates the covenant with Abraham. And of course, that's important within the context of the larger story that our authors and editors will want to tell us. Let's finally think about the nature of who is being saved here. Not just humans, of course, but part of God's created order, creatures and birds and so on. What we have here is a picture of a remnant. And of course, the concept of remnant is deeply ingrained in the whole biblical story, the whole deep biblical narrative. And our author is bringing us right back to, again, grasp God's heart to preserve a remnant out of which he will bring about the salvation of the world. This story is not about total destruction. All of creation is not destroyed. And of course, in Noah and his descendants, his family, a remnant of God's creation is saved. And of course, the continuation of the human story is secured, is enabled. But of course, this covenant is not just for humankind, it's for the whole of creation. The flood will be devastating. The impact on it will strip creation back almost to nothing. But 8 people are to be saved, along with a sufficient amount of creatures and birds and so on to repopulate God's world and his creation. It's stripped right back to its minimum. You couldn't lessen it in any way if you had any offer of hope for the future of God's world. We're almost taken back to Genesis chapter 1 again and Genesis chapter 2, right back to where it all started. And so alongside Noah and his family, we have the wild animals, we have the livestock, we have the creatures that move along the ground, we have the birds and creatures that have wings and so on. Everything is stripped down to its lowest possible number, but it still ensures continuation. And at the heart of the flood story, as devastating and as awful as the author wants us to experience it to be, there is hope and there is the offer, the opportunity for continuation. Whatever we read in Genesis chapter 6 through to Genesis chapter 7 towards the end of it, this is not the end. It may have felt like the end, but it's not the end. The story of God in relation to his creation, the author wants us to understand, will continue because he is the God of grace. He is the God of covenant and faithfulness to his promises.